Welcome to the Hero Maker podcast. I'm Andrea Schreeman, writer, director, EP, living in LA.
I'm Jennifer Morrison, and I currently serve as the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Vermont.
We are here to seek out and tell the full story of our friends who were murdered in college, Rachel Raver and Warren Fulton III.
We really need to make sure that their deaths were not in vain and that every possible lesson and improvement for the system can be squeezed from the retelling of the circumstances that ultimately led to the identification of their killer.
Welcome back to the Hero Maker podcast. I'm Andrea Schreeman. I am with the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Vermont.
Jen Morrison, at your service, Madam Shreems.
Jen, are you in, what do you call it when you guys are making laws in session?
Oh, yes. The legislative session is in full swing.
What are you learning?
It's classified. I can't get into it right now, but we're about a week and a half away from crossover, which is when bills have to be voted out of one chamber of the legislature and make the crossover to the other side. So this is like the throes.
Time is running out.
Well, it should run out on some of these bills, but other ones, it's really important that they make it to crossover so that the other chamber of the process can consider them.
Awesome. So you're right in it. And this is your first time doing that, right? Like now that
It's my third legislative session working for Department of Public Safety, but it's my first leg session at the helm, like being the boss of the organization. And it definitely is a different perspective than when I was the policy director, which I was deeply involved with the legislature, but it was like a thin slice of the topical areas. And then as deputy commissioner, the slice was a little bit broader of my portfolio that I was responsible for. And now it's the whole slice across all 7 divisions of public safety, plus a whole bunch of, issues and stuff that intersect with our work. So it's a lot.
One of the things that we're going to talk about in this episode is when things go right.
Yeah.
When everybody does their job and things move along and you get the right outcome. I know you probably can't say much, but can you apply that idea to what you're going through with the legislature right now and, how it works in Vermont?
Well, I mean, there is a process, right? It's not nearly as linear or full of instructions that must be obeyed as working a jury trial is. I would say it's a little bit more like making sausage. You don't necessarily want to go into the sausage factory and see what the ingredients are and how they get put together, but you hope the product is tasty. That's right. So that's where we are right now. We're in like peak sausage making.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Got it. So I don't want to know the details.
And just for the record, because we know how much I love bacon.
Yeah.
I don't love sausage as much as I love bacon, not even close.
All right. No, bacon boys. You heard that here. Bacon for life. Hashtag bacon for life.
Bacon every way possible.
Yes, especially dipped in white chocolate.
Mm.
Well, we have such a special guest today. Goodness. Ray was the foreman of the jury on Rachel and Warren's second trial. And he has remained friends with the Raver family this whole time, which is how we were able to get in touch with him. And he agreed to share his experience with our audience. And we had such a great conversation, didn't we?
Oh, he's lovely. And it was such an interesting perspective. It's one that I don't think I have really ever tried to place myself in the shoes of, right? Of being a juror. But it was a long time ago. And I was amazed that he was able to recall as many details as he could. And it was just an absolute delight getting to know Ray. I would not be sad if our paths crossed again. He's lovely.
Yeah, he's a great guy, and he definitely brings a unique perspective.
I think it puts a lot of color on the process by which Alfredo Prieto was ultimately brought to justice in terms of for Rachel and Warren's case. We knew he had already been adjudicated on the West Coast, but this fills in a big gap of how Rachel and Warren's killer was finally held accountable and executed. And for me, it was very fulfilling.
Yeah. It's also really interesting to hear about the limitation that the jurors experience, like the media deprivation and not knowing his history and having no idea that he was on death row in another state.
Or that there had already been a trial, there had already been a previous trial. They had no idea.
Right. Yeah, that's true. So This is Ray Melusky, and it was our great honor to have this conversation with him that we are sharing with you now. So, Ray, we're really honored to be with you. It's just amazing to me that you've had this 2.5 decades long relationship with Dee Dee Raver, and I know you knew her mom, and you probably met at least Matt.
Matt and one of her other sisters.
That's wild because you were not only a juror on Rachel and Warren's case in their trial, but you were the foreman.
Correct, yes. And what's interesting is I didn't discover until after the trial, there were actually 3 separate trials. First one was a hung jury. They couldn't get anything done. The second one that I was on, we threw the book at them basically, but the Virginia Supreme Court decided there was something wrong with the form that I filled out. It's just a Word document, there was something wrong with it, some technicality. They had a third trial, as I understand, and they just basically were not about guilt or innocence. They were about the penalty.
Right. Can you back us up a little bit from before that trial? What did you do in your career? How did you spend your time prior to becoming the foreman of this jury?
Okay. I've been an electrical engineer my entire life, and I was working at Homeland Security at the time. I used to work for the Navy before that, Naval Laboratories, Naval Intelligence. That's pretty much been my whole career, and I just retired a little over 2 years ago.
Oh, good for you. So, electrical engineer, I got to believe that details matter to you, structure, process, etc. I mean, that you strike me as somebody who's going to be really paying attention to the details.
To the letter of the instructions. I mean, I know how to follow instructions. I'd been enlisted in the Marine Corps many, many years ago. You just read it word for word for word and do exactly what they tell you to do.
What was it like being a juror on such a serious case? I mean, I know people who've gone to jury draw and they weren't selected, and I know some who have been selected, but they were not nearly as high profile a case. What was it like?
Well, you get a phone call the night before and it says, come in or don't come in. And so everybody goes in and they sit on hard benches and they ask you some questions one by one. I was indifferent as to whether I was on this case. They selected 12 jurors and 2 alternates, I believe. When we got in the room, I was the only person who had prior jury duty. So you're it. We'll make you the foreman. I had a sense of dread about the whole thing because that prior case that I was on the jury for, it was a bunch of bickering children that couldn't agree on anything, and they were threatening to go to the judge and this and that. That was a hung jury. And I thought, please don't let that happen here.
What kind of case was that first one?
Domestic violence of some sort in Alexandria. I was living there at the time. With this trial, I was thinking, please don't let that happen. And I basically begged everybody that whether we write this guy a parking ticket or we string him up there in the courtroom, let's all be unanimous and get something done. Because I later discovered they spent a total of $750,000 between these assorted trials.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That is a lot.
So let's see, what was it like? Have you ever been on jury duty?
No, they don't usually let cops or police chiefs be on juries.
Okay. Voir dire, you're out.
Yeah, so, right.
Basically, we sort of, file into the jury box and they present a certain witness or an expert testimony or something like that. And then at some point, they order us all out of the room and we go around and just talk. It's kind of like being a meeting facilitator where some people never shut up. Some people won't say anything. So you kind of have to go around the room and say, okay, you get 2 minutes, you get 2 minutes, you get 2 minutes. We're all taking notes. So we're on the same page. We all heard the same thing. Then at a certain time, they call you back into the jury box and the next expert witness, then they send you out of the room and you just keep progressively taking notes.
So can I ask you a little bit more about that? Because as the foreman, you're not just a juror trying to evaluate the evidence and the credibility of the witnesses. You're actually running a process behind the scene.
It's almost like being an errand boy. Anytime somebody needs something, you send a note out to the judge, and one of the jurors was having problems with their employer, and the judge wrote a nastygram saying, this is a seated juror, leave her alone, and this kind of thing. So I was trying to be a facilitator, but I didn't want to overstep my bounds and, upset anybody. And, we're all adults. Let's just see if we can get this done.
Well, I like what I heard you say about how, we all have been in those meetings or public forums or whatever where one or two voices dominate the conversation. And it sounds like you were approaching it with an intentionality of making sure that the quietest people, the most introverted people, were getting as much airtime as those who are going to put it all out there, more extroverted.
Absolutely. It's 12 equal votes, and everybody's voice should be heard, and not some excessively and some being quiet. So it worked pretty good.
Did they give you any instructions about being the jury foreman? I know they give jurors a lot of instructions, but did they say like, okay, hey, Ray, here's the juror 4-person handbook?
No, they didn't give me anything like that. All these other jurors think I'm some kind of legal expert because I've been on one hung jury previously, and which is not the case at all. I just kind of went with the flow. They usually left a deputy in that room with us. Except at certain points, he would step out, but he was like the go-between between us and the judge and running notes back and forth. And at one point, one of the jurors had a question, what is the dimensions of whatever the weapon was that was involved? And we sent it out. We got back an asterogram saying, you will only consider the information that has been presented to you. I think one other time we asked a question and he gave us the same answer. You're just going to consider what we have presented. Okay.
You don't get to do your own investigation. You got to go with what they gave you.
Yeah, that's it.
I do want to edify one point. It sounds like because of your former jury experience, even how brief it was, that you had a real commitment to having the process go as seamlessly as possible and having everyone be on the same page to keep reviewing that we all have the same information to try to reduce the amount of confusion and the amount of potential conflict. And also to get the job done that the taxpayers had entrusted you with.
And it worked really well from my perspective. I mean, everything seemed to go off without a hitch.
It's pretty amazing that you had that clear of an intention. I just want to acknowledge you for that. And I'm glad that it did go off generally without a hitch.
Me too.
When you walk into a trial, you have no idea how long it's going to last. I think it was like 6 or 8 week trial, right?
Yeah.
What was that experience like, being away from your family or seeing how it was evolving and how long it was going to take? What was that like? Just the amount of time away from your predictable life.
I don't live too far from the courthouse, so to me it was much easier than commuting to downtown Washington, D.C. So it was actually a benefit for me. They weren't too happy about it because, they want you in there doing work. But our in-house attorney said, hey, back off. This guy's on this jury trial. And did that answer your question, Andrea?
I think we were trying to get at you go in and you're seated as a juror and you have no idea if you're going to be there for one day or, in your case, 7 or 8 weeks.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what the experience was like to be kind of pulled out of your day-to-day life and now you've no control over what's going to happen in the next unknown number of days?
Since we were not sequestered, we didn't have to go to a hotel or anything like that. You could go home every night and you just couldn't read any newspapers. You couldn't watch TV about anything to do with the trial, and you couldn't even talk to anybody. What was interesting is I was working out at a Gold's Gym. One of the assistant prosecutors worked out there too. And we made eye contact just briefly and we went opposite directions. We did this thing by the book.
Not being sequestered made it more tolerable considering the duration of the event.
Yeah, I would say definitely so. Yeah.
Was it much of a disruption to your family? I mean, the content was really dark, even though you're not supposed to, quote, talk to anybody about it. I'm imagining that you did maybe talk to your wife a little bit about it. What was the impact to your family, if at all?
Actually, my wife is an immigrant from the former Soviet Union. She speaks so English. I don't think she knew what was going on. She might have cared if she knew, but just radio silence.
It must have been difficult. I mean, can you tell me a little bit about the emotional toll this took in real time as you were seeing evidence, hearing witnesses, and maybe you could also carry us forward like to today, the emotional toll of this case?
Well, this guy really had it coming, it seemed. The only thing that really stands out in my mind, 2 things. Number one, those graphic, disgusting pictures, all these murder victims laying there. The other was when they were reading the verdict in court, the clerk of the court gets up there and reads, okay, on the first count of capital murder, we, the jury, found guilty, signed Raymond G. Melusky Jr. And I wasn't at all prepared for that. My face turned red. I was just like, wow.
Yeah, just put that right out there. How did that feel? Did you feel exposed or vulnerable at that point?
No, I wouldn't say either one of those. It was kind of a shock. I wasn't expecting my name to be read out in court like that 5 separate times. I'm okay with it. I mean, I guess that they're following procedures and this is the way it goes. I was good with it within 5 minutes of that happening.
Have there been times since you served on that trial that you've thought about the events of the trial or Rachel or Warren or
The other victims?
Absolutely. I mean, it's just graphically horrifying, and you hear all these details. So my heart definitely went out to the ravers, and that's why I keep in touch, frankly.
You really got to know so much about what happened. I know it was only a snapshot in time, and it's not all of who Rachel or Warren was, right?
Yeah,
But that's some intense intimacy that you're sharing in that courtroom. It makes sense that you would connect with family members who wanted to connect.
yeah, and I'm curious about when you first actually got to meet them and what that was like.
okay, yeah, it was after the trial was concluded. We were in a hallway in the courthouse and we just started talking and just kept in touch, exchanged business cards and that sort of thing. But going back to the events of the trial, one thing that was disturbing was watching this Prieto guy. He's over there with these pictures, he's looking at them, trying to identify victims and stuff like that. I mean, that was disturbing.
Tell me more about that. Why was it disturbing? Did you think he might be gaining pleasure by seeing these photos of what he did?
I don't know if he was gaining pleasure, but he's just kind of sitting there methodically looking at them and
A normal human should have a visceral reaction to these photos.
think of him like a two-legged animal. He's not really a human.
Yeah, you're not the first person who's described him in interesting ways.
Well, take your time and tell us some more about what you remember about seeing him in court.
He had this giant tattoo on his neck. It said PNS, which I later found out is Pomona Northside. It's a gang in Los Angeles somewhere. I remember the first time I laid eyes on him, he's sitting there smiling and laughing and, just like, how you doing? Nodding his head. And then when you start to find out what he's being accused of, it's like, where did that come from? I kind of looked at them collectively at that defense table. I didn't really spend too much time looking at Prieto, other than when you're doing the guilt or innocence phase, they don't tell you anything about his past misdeeds. But then once we found him guilty, they start saying, well, he did this murder, he did this murder, he did this murder, he's been on death row for 20 years. I remember just kind of staring at him, having never knowingly been that close to such a vile person.
That must have been a bit of a pivot for you, like a relief, like, oh, we got this right. The guy was already on death row and these cases have been adjudicated.
Well, yeah, correct. In fact, the only point of contention was whether he was guilty or innocent. And there was some discussion and eventually everybody went along with it. But then when you find out all these other things he did, it's like, thank God we got this right.
Yeah.
Was there a moment where you were concerned that you would not have full alignment on the guilty verdict?
No, I think it just took a lot longer to engage in the discussion. It was going to happen, and I wasn't too worried about it. I could see it happening, and people were asking questions, and they should be asking questions. This is what we're going to do, and that's what we did. So that was the only point of inflection in the entire process, and it was overcome, and we did the right thing.
I wasn't there. I wish I could have been there for the trials. Can you please share some specific memories of things that were said by people who were called to the stand?
Things that left a big impression on you or other jurors.
Well, the DNA evidence was very impactful, I will say that. But it's just a steady parade of experts going up on the stand, and it all kind of blends together. It's been quite a while. I think all the jurors were polite and respectful and thoughtful.
Do you remember hearing the testimony of any of Prieto's family members?
You really got me stumped on that. I'm trying to
Former
think.
wives? No?
No, nothing that really stood out and is stuck in my memory.
What about police officers, investigators who testified?
Okay, here's one for you, Andrea. They got Prieto's mother on the stand, and she started crying. She just didn't understand why he was there. He told her he didn't do it,
So it must be true.
Yeah.
Because nobody lies to their mama.
Nope, never. Absolutely not.
Can you draw us a little bit of a word picture? Was she a docile woman? Was she we don't know anything about his mom. In fact, I've never even heard his mom mentioned. I've only heard about his dad.
Okay. Her, I remember because she broke down crying on the stand. She's, yeah, a pretty docile person, petite. His brother went up there. He had been in prison, but he turned his life around. He started a couple businesses, was having children, and looked like he had turned it around. One of the interesting things is I actually feel sorry for Prieto's family because they didn't raise him to do this kind of stuff. Not anywhere near as much as Rachel, but I did feel some empathy towards them. They're just his family and they're stuck with him and kind of how it went down.
We've had some folks describe that they thought Prieto's eyes were remarkable. Do you remember? Because you got to actually see him. If he's at the defense table and you're sort of perpendicular, a lot of people who witnessed the trial were behind him and only saw the back of his head.
Okay.
But presumably you saw his face, you saw the way he animated or didn't. Could you tell me a little bit about his persona, his nonverbals, his facial expressions?
He was pretty dour. He just kind of sat there and didn't say much. Somehow I later came to be aware that he was not cooperating with his defense team at all. Just looked disinterested and he just kind of sat there. We never got to hear him speak except one time. They sent a tape recording of him being recorded in the Fairfax County Jail. He sounded like he was very nonchalant. I mean, he was on the phone saying, "Yeah, they're treating me really bad down here." I'm thinking, man, what a weirdo.
So you said you had a view of the defense table. You weren't necessarily just looking at him. What is your memory of looking toward the defense table and what that experience was like?
Just visually, it's not much different than looking at the prosecution. He had two main lawyers, and it's more what they said than what they looked like. I mean, I remember some of the things that Shapiro was saying were clearly just lawyer tricks. And I'm not a lawyer, but it's just obvious he's just trying to blow smoke and create reasonable doubt where very little exists.
Can you give me an example?
That's what I'm racking my brain to see.
You're doing great with racking your brain. You came up with 2 family members so far. So we're going to rack your brain a little bit more.
The Williamson County Cultural Arts Commission of Franklin, Tennessee wishes to thank our men and women in blue who help us deliver safe and fun family and community cultural events year-round, including one of the only authentic bluegrass festivals in the country. Bluegrass Along the Harpeth takes place every July and at the Williamson County Fair in August and at the annual Tennessee International Independent Film Festival. Check out our full calendar of events at wccac-tn.org.
I have to say, he had some hotshot lawyers. He had some high caliber attorneys. Did they come across that way?
In some cases, yeah. In some cases, no. They were kind of gimmicky. One kind of strange thing that happened, you're not supposed to talk to anybody about anything, but my daughter was in daycare center down the street, and we go whizzing by the courthouse, and there's Shapiro. He just kind of looks at me in the car, and I just turned my head away. And that was the closest I ever came to any contact with him.
That was during the trial or another time?
No, it was during the trial.
Oh, that's creepy.
Yeah, it is. It was really creepy.
Did it feel like intimidation?
No, not at all. I mean, he was just he looked in shock. Some of the other things right before the sentencing, the other lawyer, not Shapiro, I forget what the other one's name is. Greenspun. Okay. Well, I think I've got him back. I can't remember one from the other, but that's the name. Right as he's making his final statements, he started crying right in front of us, like he's appealing to our emotions. And I thought, there's an outside chance that's true, but I think he's really just, I don't know. It kind of turned me off.
Who cried, the attorney or Prieto?
No, the attorney. Prieto never batted an eye.
Some people have told us that his eyes were unique. Do you have any recollection of Alfredo Prieto's eyes?
I don't think they were really unique that I could see. I mean, he just looked like a Hispanic guy who'd been on death row for 20 years. I think he wore glasses and he had that tattoo on his neck. And no, they may have, but it didn't make an impression on me.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So one of the defense attorneys cried.
Yes. But I think he was trying to make a really impassioned plea that, if you could know the Prieto that I know, maybe over a cup of coffee or a beer, or you might see him in a different light. And they bring out all these pictures that he's drawing in his jail cell, that he sends to his niece and nephew. And it was sort of an emotional appeal that I wasn't having any part of.
They were trying to humanize him so that you could
Yeah.
feel guilty about sentencing another human to death.
Correct. Yes, that was my impression.
I get the sense that the emotional side of all this is not going to trip you up at all, like, because you are an engineer and you have a very analytical brain. Were there others on the jury who perhaps were more emotive or empathetic to that stunt by the attorney?
I would say not that I could visibly tell. I mean, these were a range of ages from retirees down to people in their 20s. And no, I don't think it worked, and it shouldn't have worked. And I couldn't detect any emotive response from any of the jurors.
I'm thinking about testimony for the prosecution. If you remember Bob Murphy ever testifying, or Rich Perez, who was the Latino officer who traveled on the airplane during extradition next to Prieto, or Veronica Raver, if you remember any of those testimonies or any other.
They start to blur together. It's just one expert followed by another witness, followed by another person. I don't want to sound callous, but they just kind of blend together. But I would say in terms of the evidence that Bob Murphy presented, that was as compelling as anything.
Can you say more about that?
Well, they mentioned that back when Rachel was murdered, you need substantial amounts of DNA to do any sort of testing, but that quantity has decreased over the years as sophistication of this testing got greater. That's why they opened this cold case. And there was one singular fact that it could have been only one person out of 7 billion that could have done this. That's roughly the planet's population at that time. So that carried a lot of weight.
And was that from a semen deposit?
I don't know. I really don't.
But it was a DNA collection and it had to be of a significant amount on her person that it was found.
Correct. But what I'm saying is I think the amount that they require has improved over the years.
Oh, yeah. But I'm just saying, I'm trying to figure out what other type of DNA might have been left behind in any quantity to be sufficient back in the day for the DNA profile to be built.
I don't remember them telling us whether it was semen or blood or, something else.
Yeah, 1 in 7 billion. That's a big number.
Yes, it is. That's quite compelling. And nobody challenged it. So ostensibly to us, the jury, it seemed this guy did it.
And then in hindsight, when you now know about his prior bad acts, it's not that hard a leap, right?
No, it's not.
So before we move on, can you talk a little bit more about the makeup of the jury and any specific personalities or moments that you remember that were definitive or impactful in the process?
No, because I think everybody was completely reasonable. Nobody had any really strong feelings one way or the other. And it was delightful that you could get people in their 60s and people in their 20s to sort of work their way through these problems. And one thing about that jury, we concluded proceedings one Friday in Fairfax Court. I remember the judge, Randy Bellows, I think, he said, would you all consider coming in on Saturday and Sunday to continue your deliberation? And I said, we already had other plans and all this sort of thing. And really what I was trying to do was get everybody to take one last breath and think about what we're getting ready to do. And when in Monday morning, it probably took an hour and a half tops. We said, okay, we've come to a verdict and this is what we want to do.
Good for you.
I don't think the judge was too pleased about taking the weekend off.
Yeah, but you're the one who's in that deliberative cycle with your colleagues on the jury, right? And you're tuned in to where people are emotionally, intellectually. Like, that's a lot of info to take in and process and try to quickly let it filter through the process and land on a decision.
Yes,
that is like cognitive overload and emotional overload.
I'm an engineer. How do I detect emotions in other people? I just saw a bunch of people sitting.
Well, don't you have a meter? Like, don't you have like a emotion meter that you plug into them and check
what were
it
you
out?
saying? You just saw what?
People just sitting around the table talking, and there's no emotion demonstrably of anybody in the room. I mean, from start to finish.
But you had a sense that giving people the breath, giving them the space to sit with this very big decision over those 2 days would make a difference.
I didn't think it would make a difference, but I wanted them one last chance to reconsider, or, if they have some further questions or whatever, we would talk it over that Monday morning. I think our mind was pretty much made up that Friday. So we all went out golfing or whatever and came in on Monday morning. And
Is that what you did? You went golfing over the weekend?
no, I don't golf. I'm just saying as a for instance, go to your favorite restaurant or whatever you want to do.
That is a mighty civic dedication.
Yeah, that's a big thing to sit through a process and to hold another person, another human being accountable in such a huge way.
Yeah, but we followed instructions right to the T. I mean, you do this, you don't do that, you disconsider this, and you consider that. For it being such a grave matter, it was actually a refreshing experience that things can, really work out pretty good.
Who do you attribute that to? Is that the way the judge ran the courtroom, or was just the system working on all cylinders? How did that become so good?
The system working on all cylinders, because everybody did their part and we got it done. I mean, even if he was found not guilty or we gave him 20 years or whatever, let's all get this right. We all came to the same conclusion, and that's what happened.
Do you remember any other courtroom actors? And I'm going to say clerks, bailiffs, deputies. Were there any other actors that were memorable from the trial?
Yeah, there's two exactly. One was the guy who was more or less assisting us in the conference room. His name was Bob. Really nice guy, probably retired by now. The other was at the actual sentencing in the courtroom. They brought in some guy that was like 6'5", 250 pounds to stand right next to Prieto, because Matt, he stood up and he yelled something at Prieto, and I think Dee Dee's mother had some words with him, and he was just there like the bouncer sort of thing.
To protect Prieto from the angry family.
Yes, or vice versa.
What do you remember about the families? Like when the verdict was read, do you have any memory of them as spectators to this?
Not much. I don't think too many people reacted, really. Maybe internally they did, but was not much external expression that I could see. So there's nothing that made an impression on me.
Talk about the death penalty for a moment,
Okay.
especially in this case.
Okay. Well, there's a couple things that surprised me. Number one, you think a death penalty is conducted in a maximum security prison, but it wasn't. It was done at a medium security prison right on the border with Virginia and North Carolina. In a one-sentence summary is that it's a medical procedure with heavy security. I can tell you lots of details because it made an impression on me.
Oh, wait, you were there for the execution?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So this is outstanding, okay, because it stands out, right? Like,
Okay.
how often does a juror go to the execution of someone that they served on a trial for? I mean, this is very unique. And I think, was it based more on your relationship with the family in that ensuing time, or was it something having to do just with your performance on the jury that drove you to want to be there?
I think it was the former, my relationship with the family, because Dee Dee and I used to email back and forth. She clearly kept better track of this than me. And she said, oh, the execution is going to be on this date. So please write to this prison and they're going to send you some forms. And I assume they do a background check on you or something like that. They give you logistic information, where to show up at the state police barracks. Then a van comes around and takes everybody to the prison. It was really a rainy day. The warden looked like she could have been president of a garden club. This little petite, soft-spoken, her driver was a 6'9" former professional basketball player. So we all get into the van. We head for the prison. They take us into like a small auditorium and they give us like a brief history of the death penalty in Virginia. Then eventually they search everybody once again and they take us into a room right next to the death chamber. It's some bleachers you'd see at a middle school football team or something like that. So everybody gets in there. I was sitting ringside right next to the prosecutor. The only real drama I saw, we're sitting there waiting. This guy's standing by the telephones, waiting for a call from the governor or something like that. Eventually, the side door bursts open. It's like, oh my God. He had like a guard on either side of him. They march him over to this gurney and they begin to strap him down in there. Then once he's in place and secured, they pull a curtain in front of it so that you won't see them if they're botching the needles going in the arm. Then they pull the curtain back and They had a needle in both arms, which I found surprising. I guess one's a backup for the other or something.
But you were able to see that even though they had pulled a curtain. Can you explain that?
No, I didn't see him put the needles in his arms. The curtain was aside when they were strapping him in. Then they pulled this curtain. They stick the needles in his arms, presumably, because when they pulled the curtain back, he's already got these things in his arm. They had a curtain behind him, and you could see these three little windows with wires or tubes or whatever coming, down towards his arms. And I assume they were the executioners. So then they say, okay, do you have any final words? He cranes his head up a little bit and he said, I'd like to thank all my supporters and family, and let's get this over with. Like we're inconveniencing. I guess we are inconveniencing. That was his final words. I guess the whole thing took like 18 minutes from start to finish. The only notable thing within the entire event was at one point his stomach rose up, like he took a deep breath or something. Then they start, with the flashlight in his eyes and see, his very sign of motion in his feet. And then they pronounce him dead.
I mean, tell me more about that. Did they bring a stethoscope around, or what do you mean they pronounced him dead?
I assume it was a doctor standing there, and I don't remember if he had a stethoscope or not. I just don't recall. Just at one point, they just said prisoner is deceased or something like that. What's interesting about that room, you could see they had the electric chair off in the far left-hand corner. Apparently in Virginia, you have a choice, and very few people choose the electric chair.
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, imagine that.
Wait, you're an electrical engineer. You know why.
I've been shocked before, but not like that. He was so uncooperative with his defense team, with the prison officials. He just didn't make a choice, and therefore they default to this lethal injection.
Oh, that's interesting. That's a detail I didn't know either, that he didn't choose, so they chose for him.
Yeah, and that's the default, as I understand.
If you or someone you know is connected either personally or as the result of violent crime to Alfredo Prieto, a convicted rapist and killer who lived in and around San Bernardino, California, Arlington, Virginia, and Jamaica, Queens, New York between the years of 1984 and 1990, we'd like to hear from you. Please email us at info@theheromakerpodcast.com.
Would you consider this as a big part of your life, like what you have done here on the planet? Or is it just like, well, it's this thing I did for a few weeks and every citizen should do it at least once in their life? Like, does it have any meaning to you in the arc of your life?
Well, first of all, I sleep like a baby. It's significant, but I've done a lot of things. I've been all over Asia. I've ridden on nuclear submarines. It's a part of my life. I wouldn't say it's like the penultimate thing I've ever done. It's a very serious matter.
It is. Can I ask you this? If this is too personal, just say so. But are you married to the same woman now? And does she speak better English?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. Okay. I was just wondering if now in the rearview mirror, she has a different perspective on what you were doing all those weeks that you were not going to work, but you were going to this other job for 7 or 8 weeks.
I don't think she cared that much. I remember before I went to the prison for the execution, she's like, you be careful down there.
Are there any jurors that you stay in touch with?
There's only one that's part of my LinkedIn network. And I haven't talked to him in years, but I could get you his contact information if you're interested.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, what that bond is like when you share that experience with someone. I can imagine that it would be very easy to just go your separate ways and go back to your real life. Yeah.
That's kind of what happened. I don't really keep in touch with any of them. Not one that I can think of.
Interesting.
Yeah.
If we could educate the system or jurors today, is there anything that you want to make sure that people know about how to have these things? I don't know. You seem to have some ideas.
The biggest thing is get along and be unanimous and follow instructions, and everything else just kind of plays out. It's really pretty simple. It's just like being a facilitator of a meeting or something.
So the system works if you follow the rules.
And if you have adults in the room, unlike the previous trial I was on.
I want to probe on that a little bit because I'm sensing, and I don't want to make an assumption that sometimes certain jurors, for whatever reason, try to decide based on emotion or feelings rather than facts and information.
I saw it more as a personality clash,
Okay.
multiple ones. That's, but I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I viewed it a little differently.
You mean like personality, like
They just rubbed each other the wrong way somehow, and I don't even.
So they
know
couldn't
the
agree. You
specifics.
can't agree if that person rubs you the wrong way, right?
Yeah, yes.
because I think when you're when you say get along and be unanimous, it almost sounds like a command, and I think that would be hard. There's got to be something that you did, and maybe this idea of equalizing everyone's voice, because in the natural way of primate politics, their voices were not going to be equal. And so you took it upon yourself to create a structure where you equalized people's voices. And I wonder if that contributed to a way to be unanimous,
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it certainly didn't hurt, but everybody got their shot, and everybody got to talk and read their notes, and it seemed to work out pretty good for some reason.
If you were thrust back 20 years ago and had to do this again, would you do something differently? Anything?
I'll have to look at my notes, but nothing that occurs to me, right off the bat. I think we're just one cog in the wheel. There's the prosecution, there's the judge, there's us, there's witnesses. Everybody's just kind of did their part. And I'm not saying there wasn't arguments in the courtroom. I mean, the prosecution and defense would bicker over certain points. I guess I expected that, and it didn't really affect us one way or the other. In fact, it probably helped us make a better decision.
Is there anything that's unsaid? I mean, we're laying down your perspective on this event, your unique perspective. We want to make sure that we document you. Is there anything you want to make sure gets said that hasn't been said yet?
The only other factoid I would throw in is because it was a rainy day right outside the prison on the day of the execution. There was a limited number of protesters. There was people out there with pickets and stuff like this. And I guess if it was nicer weather, there would have been more. But there was maybe less than a dozen.
The picketers were people who were anti-death penalty or very specifically fighting for the life of this person?
Oh, this guy had no friends. He'd been on death row for 20 years. I mean, who is advocating for him besides his defense attorney? So I'm certain that it was just anti-death penalty.
Andrea, in the questions you sent, because I don't think I saw the questions, can you make sure we've covered them all?
Well, I would just say, why don't you take a look at the list and see if there's anything on there that you would like to answer, because we have had a nice conversation, and we really appreciate your time and your perspective.
Okay, question number 1. Why do you think you stayed connected to the Raver family? Sympathy and friendship, plain and simple. Did you ever interact with the defense team? No. You ever met the Fultons or the Jeffersons? The Fultons, no. In terms of Mrs. Jefferson, after the execution, they had it sounds macabre, but it was kind of like an after party. We all got together at the state police department and had some cake and punch and all this stuff. And so I met Mrs. Jefferson there.
What did you think of Velda? Because she made a big impression on me.
She was a very congenial person. And it turns out she was raising money for some kind of something. And I sent her a check for $50 a couple weeks later.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Is there anything you wish had gone differently in terms? Oh, no, we went over that. Oh. The biggest thing is I've got these pictures of dead bodies burned into my brain. That's the only thing a lot of this stuff I hadn't thought about in years. But I think they're permanently a part of me.
The pictures or the people because of the pictures?
Mostly the pictures, because that's pretty macabre stuff. It was morbid. When you see dead bodies laying there with their eyes, usually when you go to a funeral, they sew their eyes shut. Here they're with their eyes wide open, looking straight up at the sky. It's like,
Is that how Rachel's pictures were? Her eyes wide open at the sky?
and some other unsavory details.
This is not for me personally because, this was a friend, and even just what you've told me is hard for me to hear. But for you, I want to give you the opportunity, if you would like to say what you see in your mind when you remember these pictures, just as a way to kind of release it. You're welcome to say it here.
What I see is a very large, high definition photograph. I can still remember the looks on their faces. That was tough to look at because it's not a horror movie. I mean, this is real life.
She was a beautiful girl and smart.
Yeah. I wish I would have got to know her, certainly under better circumstances. But
Yeah. And Warren was a cute All-American athlete, very devoted, funny guy, very family oriented.
they said he was the captain of his baseball team.
He was not the captain. Was
Not
he
at
was the-
GW, but he could have been a captain somewhere else.
Oh, right. He came from a different program. He transferred in and he also played high school ball. So he might have been a captain of a team, but not at the time at GW. But they were kind of like the all-American clean living people. I mean, listen, they left the bar on Saturday night early when everyone else was out till whatever bar closing so that they could go home to be at a church event with Warren's parents the next morning. And somehow Prieto intersected with them between about 10 o'clock and whenever the time of death was. I'm sorry that those high def photos are burned in your head. I can empathize. I've got way too many crime scenes etched in my brain.
Do you?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Um,
No, Jen, can you?
Oh no, I want to hear how Ray deals with it because let's not take any advice from Jen.
Well,
Well, let's hear how Ray has dealt with that over the years, and then I'll chime in. How's that?
okay.
well, I don't think they're ever going away. And they don't really haunt me because I didn't do anything wrong. But I hadn't talked about this stuff in years and years. So yeah, I can deal with it. I mean, it's not like permanently in front of my eyeballs, but I think about it, maybe once every couple months or something.
Yeah, I think that the brain has a certain way of processing traumatic images, and sometimes your brain is able to make sense of them and tuck them away in a file, but it's almost like greatest hits. Every now and then they just have to come back out for a visit around your psyche. Anything that you remember, you also have the ability to wrap this in a shroud of we did the right thing and we held someone accountable for these gruesome images.
Yeah.
And that's not dissimilar from how I processed some of the things that I saw in my career as a police officer, that when we were able to hold someone accountable, bring them to justice, give answers to the family, that it somehow didn't balance, but lessened the sting of the depravity that we bore witness to.
I also think that if you see lots of this stuff, you probably become a little bit inured to it.
A little bit would be the perfect word.
Okay.
I think if you ever lose perspective of the fact that these are fellow humans that these crimes have been perpetrated on, then you've been in the game too long. I suspect it depends on how well you compartmentalize or what your emotional makeup is, but the constant layering on of tragedy and traumatic images is a real thing. And it's not just the big cases like Warren and Rachel, it's the difficult crashes where people are badly deformed or injured, but maybe not dead. It's the way somebody would disfigure and harm an intimate partner or a family member, a child, a baby, break a baby's arm, bruise a child. It's the constant layering on of that becomes the possibility of becoming callous to it, or it's not exclusive one another, and also the possibility of it creating some real trauma in first responders' minds and ability to be resilient.
I can imagine.
I know Andrea asked it a different way, but if there's anything you could say to a prosecutor or a defense attorney about how to do their job better, how to make the system work the way more fairly or efficiently, what would you say?
I think the prosecution did its job very well. I think the defense was a little bit gimmicky at times, and that actually worked against them. Looks like cheap lawyer tricks.
Yeah, no, I think that's solid advice because, I mean, it might work with some jurors, but clearly not with the crew you were in charge of.
It was a good crew.
Yeah, sounds it. Andrea, anything else?
No, that's it. I just want to say thank you so much for your time and your recollection, your willingness to be with us.
Yeah, and I would tell you both, if any further questions come up tomorrow or next week or next month, don't hesitate to reach out for any reason.
No,
Thank
that's very
you,
kind.
Ray.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for helping us tell the story in the most holistic way we possibly can. Really appreciate it.
That was such a fun interview, Andrea, and not fun like haha fun, but like trying to pluck out the non-sterile side of Ray, who's clearly he's an engineer,
Analytical, yeah.
analytical, linear, came across like an engineer would. And yet there were so many times when he was sort of talking to us freestyle where you saw the emotional side of him when he was talking about some of the images that he remembers, and he says at least once a month, they kind of just pop into his head.
And also the warmth for the family that he's carried all these years and the connection that he felt. And he also was so detailed about the execution. Like that is also like a really seems like memorable part of the whole experience for him.
Yeah, I thought that so much of what he had to say helped fill in a lot of blanks. And I'm so grateful that he was willing to revisit this. I know it can't be easy for anyone who has to kind of reach back in their memory bank and bring this back to the forefront. But Ray did a great job. And
he did a great job as a foreman.
Oh, yeah, right. Let's talk about that.
He walked in with such clarity of, this is not going to be a mess. We're all going to communicate and we're going to give them what we are required to give them, which is a verdict.
Well, and he did something back then that I doubt there was a name for back then, but he really respected process equity. So he did not allow the loudest voice in the room to always be an oxygen robber and drive other people to a place. He intentionally made it equitable that every voice got the same amount of airtime and that nobody rode over the top of anyone. And that, I think, was not a thing back in the day, but he did it.
And we've heard this over and over and over again about this trial and this team, that everybody played their part. I mean, even the description that he had of the defense team and the tricks and whatever, it was their part to defend him in whatever way that they felt was the most robust and could get as much traction as, but that was their part to play.
Right. I also thought it was interesting that understanding, of course, that he is emotionally detached to some degree during the trial, right? And he has an opportunity to see Prieto, but he doesn't remember the things that some of the loved ones and the people who
brought so much more emotion,
right,
anger, and
right,
yeah, and incompleteness, because they were coming with like, this is going to be the answer to all these feelings that I've had for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And for him, it was a puzzle.
It was a puzzle to be solved.
It really helped that he's such an analytical guy. Yeah, I am very confident that would not be my experience on a jury of this magnitude and this kind of crime. I would probably need years and years and years of therapy. And I don't think I could have handled it as anesthetically as he did.
Well, I'm sure, I mean, you're artsy and creative and he's an electrical engineer, but let's be really clear. Like he said, I had a good crew. So somehow the 12 plus the 2,
the blending of all those different personalities had something to do with it.
And the way he led the process, the deliberative process, somehow they got where they needed to be. But anyway, I this was a very interesting interview for me, and he's adorable. I would love to hang out with him.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. It was really great to be with you. You're a great guy, and you were a kick butt foreman. And
thank you for doing your job. The end result was justified. Peace out.
Thanks to sound mixer and podcast producer Michael Doherty, sound designer Andy Bill of Submachine Audio, and graphic designer Jungleen Bay. Thanks also to me, Hero Maker director and producer Andrea Schreeman. Please subscribe to the show where you listen to podcasts and take a moment to rate us. It really helps the podcast grow. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hero Maker Pod. Want to collaborate or suggest a guest? Please email us at media@theheromakerpodcast.com. The Hero Maker Podcast is a production of Prudent Pictures. Thank you so much for listening.